First, it's important to note this is going to be a long introduction, okay? So, studying Mao is very difficult. First of all, he reigned during the Cold War. Also, he used censorship, didn't allow outsiders in, was very anti-foreigner. So there's not a lot of records that came out until later. As a result, in being in the Cold War, he was vilified by Western historians in the early days, and now he seems to be almost, heroic. So he's very complicated to study, and he's going to be very complicated to write about for your IB exam. I would say focus on the instability in China. It's also a reason for expansion from Japan, and understand that China had been forced into humiliating treaties from the West. It had a very strong anti-foreigner culture anyways, dating back for forever, basically. And then they were just carved up by the West. So by the 1900s, you get a lot of people that are mad. Not to mention in the early 20th century, peasants in China were just struggling to survive. They didn't really care about the ideology of communism or nationalism or any of the various, or democracy. They just wanted to eat. They resented the heavy government taxes they had to pay. And townspeople were also under pressure from inflation, and they were hostile to this corrupt government that existed. Students were going to be monumental in the overthrowing of the monarchy. They really, really wanted effective reforms. Here's another reason why this can be a complicated subject to study. Most of the things written before, I would even argue like 1990, were written in the old Wade-Giles system, which was created by the British. It means that a lot of words aren't pronounced how they sound. It's very difficult. The Pinyin, which is the new one, which was created in the 1980s, sought to kind of help it so that it helps me so that I can pronounce things. And honestly, I'm just gonna mess up and pronounce things. That's just how it is. But I would say the new translation is much easier. But as a result, you're gonna see confusion a lot. You're gonna see two different names, for instance, Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Shi. Who's to say? Also, that's going to translate itself into documents. I would say I'm going to do what I do, which is just pick one translation, Pinyin. I'm going to respect, the Chinese translations, but understand that there's just no easy way to pronounce or translate Chinese into English, and I'm going to mess it up. So after all these years of humiliation, China is going to just explode in 1911. The leader of this revolution is going to be Sun Yat-sen, who thought that perhaps democracy was the way forward for China. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. So he's going to declare a new China, a new republic, and be in control of the National Assembly. He's going to rule just for a short time before he steps down in favor of a man named Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was a military officer, and he had the loyalty of the army. And frankly, if you didn't have the loyalty of the army at this time, you weren't going to last. But anyways, the Qing dynasty falls, and that's it for them. They'd been ruling since 1644, and they were actually a Manchu dynasty, so they were from Manchuria. This is going to be important in the Chinese Civil War. So anyways, we're going to have this republic, and then for a time, Yuan Shikai is going to declare himself emperor, and it looks like you just have a new dynasty being born. He's going to die in 1916, and his followers go back to their little provinces all over, and then they become warlords. And so you have the period of a warlord period, I mean, that's repetitive, but anyways, you have the warlord period again. This happens a lot in Chinese history, by the way. And so that happens. And then, of course, also at the end of the First World War, all those German, areas in China are going to be given to the Japanese. The worst possible thing the Allies could do was give this to the Japanese. It's going to turn a lot of Chinese people away from having a republic. They're going to think, well, that's the Western style of government. It's going to make it easier for the CCP to rise in the end. This is another complicated figure. I mean, he is going to reign as a virtual dictator in Taiwan until his death shockingly in the same time around Mao and coincidentally Franco, around 1976, I believe, 75, somewhere around there, 75. So anyways, he's going to, use all the same things Mao does. He just uses it with a constitution in Taiwan. But that's for later study. He rose to power as an army officer. So again, you can see in China, you have to be a very good military officer, and that's what he did. He took leadership in 1925 of the GMD, so he's going to be in charge of the nationalists. He's going to actually fight the warlords and be rather successful. He joins with Mao and Zhao Enlai, Enlai, who's also going to help him. So Jiang manages to keep power really until after World War II. He loses during the Civil War. Some of the problems that he's going to have is he's just not going to be as good of a leader. And also he hated communists. So instead of like making a deal with them, and several times he makes a deal with them and then goes back on his word. So that's going to be problematic. But he is responsible for ending the warlord period, and he will help during Japanese occupation as well. Again, he is complicated to study. I mean, a few things I can tell you. He came from a rich peasant family, but, as a peasant, he was of the lower class. And so this is going to play against him when he later goes to universities. And even in his rise in the CCP, a lot of people held the fact that he was a peasant against him. When he was like 14 years old, he was forced into an arranged marriage with a 17-year-old. He later will run away from this marriage, and he'll always be against arranged marriages as a result. He'll never recognize that one, by the way. She ends up dying at the age of 21 of consumption or dysentery or some horrible disease like that. He's also hard to study because just, the propaganda he used, he created his own story, and then the propaganda used against him, growing up, I just thought he was scary, but this was like the 1980s, so, who knew? Who knows, really? And that, it's ironic as well, he was a teacher and a journalist, so was Mussolini. So there's something about teaching that, attracts dictators, I guess. Early on, he argued with other CCP leaders over the role of peasants in the army or in the CCP. The early leaders wanted it to be an urban affair. They wanted to follow Marxism, and they didn't really want to deal with peasants. And this is what the Soviet Union did, and that ended up, not working really well for them. And so that is what really makes Mao take over the CCP, is because he argued that peasants should be in it. And that is why we call his form of communism Maoism. He thought that they should be a part of the movement, and it was actually really correct. In China, with the majority of people being peasants, you can't leave them out if you want a mass movement of people. Jiangxi is going to break the alliance in 1927, and this put the CCP on a defensive war. As a result, Mao is going to form a peasant army, and it's going to be pretty strong with about 12,000 again by 1927. They were well disciplined, they were reliable, they respected him. One of the things that he did was he had discipline. I mean, you could not disobey an order, but neither could you or would you be treated unequally. Officers and all generals, in fact, had to share the same hardships as ordinary men. And they were otherwise treated as equals and could not be beaten by officers, unlike in the GMD army. So as a result, this was a force of peasants that he trained in tactics. Um, the army was, however, poorly equipped, so they had to rely on basic weapons rather than guns. This led to the development of guerrilla tactics. Small, lightly armed bands of Red Army soldiers would merge with the civilian population, disguised as peasants, or they would retreat into underground tunnels, linking villages to attack the larger army forces when and where they least expected it. In 1929, Mao's band moved to a more fertile area in the south, and this time period is known as the Jiangxi Soviet. Mao became the CC party secretary and ordered land distribution. Poor peasants were even encouraged to kill their richer neighbors. and any landlord that was mean to peasants. Those who did disagree with Mao's line and those he suspected of disloyalty were going to be killed. In 1930, it is said that Mao ordered 2,000 Red Army soldiers to be shot for staging a simple revolt. In an attempt to flee the GMD, our communists are going to march north, far north, in almost an 8,000-mile march. Most of them will die, and as a result, you would think this was a big failure, but it's entered into legend. Mao himself said this: "Has there ever been in history a long march like ours? No, never. The Long March is also a manifesto. It proclaims to the world that the Red Army is an army of heroes, and that the imperialists and their jackals, Chiang Kai-shek and his like, are perfect nonentities. The Long March has sown many seeds in the 11 provinces, which will sprout, grow leaves, blossom into flowers, bear fruit, and yield a crop in the future." Here things were different. The peasants were won over by land distribution, but there wasn't the killing of rich peasants or anything like that you found in the South. So things chilled out a little bit. He also managed to stamp out corruption. He did quite a few things that to help improve literacy and also improved homes, schools, hospitals, and factories as a result. Mao and the communist leaders did control all political decision making, but peasants and others participated in revolutionary committees. Mass meetings were also held that helped people, kind of come to the support or at least support the communists at this time. Also, during this period, Mao is going to study and do a lot of writings. I mean, this is going to be one of the times where he's working on his most famous book. But understand too that no outside press or radio communication was allowed, and no, nothing. There was complete and total censorship within the population. So that first phase of the Chinese Civil War kind of ends with a stalemate. Mao is isolated, licking his wounds, retraining army, finding more peasants. I mean, that's the thing about building a peasant army that Mao is going to excel at, is because there's an endless supply of men. By rejecting peasants, the other side is going to be weakened by that. But that's beside the point. What brings these two sides together was the Japanese. When Japan invades in 1937, this does cause a massive problem. Now, understand that while the CCP and the GMD both, create this united front, they are not fighting with their militaries together. Mao will keep his military and fight the Japanese. Kai-shek will keep his military and fight the Japanese. So this is important to remember. Also, it's also important to know that Chiang Kai-shek had to be forced into this agreement. He actually had to be arrested to agree to do this. So there's that as well. So it's no surprise in 1941 when Chiang breaks this agreement and again attacks communist forces in the South. This was an action portrayed by the communists as unprincipled. I mean, they had a deal. Also, with the US and Britain entering the war in the Far East, followed by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Chiang's government was accused of dependence on foreign allies. So this isn't going to win him any, population points on the front. The CCP, on the other hand, were able to advertise themselves as truly Chinese patriots. So this is going to hurt him when the Civil War breaks out again after World War II. So the outbreak of the Civil War had many reasons. This was just a continuation of a fight that had been enduring for a long time over who was going to control China. And the end of the Second World War just saw this spring back to life. Despite the nationalist poor showing in the war against the Japanese defeat in 1945 left the Allies ready to recognize Chiang Kai-shek as the legitimate leader of China. They gave China a seat even on the Security Council of the United Nations, which in the end is going to not be a great move on their part, but they did. So this was all to undermine Mao, who was a very popular leader at home. The U.S. continued to supply aid, arms, and advisors to Chiang Kai-shek and helped the nationalists to move back into areas in northern China and Manchuria that had been liberated by the Soviet Red Army. The communists resisted this move and reinforced their soldiers with weapons captured from the Japanese and handed over to them by the former Russian occupation forces. Nevertheless, neither Russia nor the U.S. wanted to see civil war in China. In August 1945, the USA organized a meeting between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, at which it was agreed that they would work together towards the creation of a democratically elected National Assembly and a single army. However, no sooner had this agreement been signed than fighting broke out over the nationalist attempt to reclaim Manchuria. A ceasefire was agreed under U.S. attempts in January 1946. A document outlining a constitution for China was even drawn up, but when the GMD subsequently tried to change this to gain greater dominance, the communists withdrew. In July 1946, the GMD launched a major offensive against the communist forces in Manchuria. Here we go, Manchuria starting another war in China. While the communists seized the industrial city of Harbin in northern Manchuria and consolidated their hold in the rural areas. From July 1946, a full-scale civil war broke out, and the U.S. negotiator George Marshall just returned home. Although the nationalists and the communists had been struggling for power since 1927, it was the Civil War from 1946 to 49 that, against all odds, secured Mao as the ruler of China. In 1946, Mao's communist military forces were reorganized as a single army known as the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and given a unified command. In the fierce four-year struggle, the PLA defeated Chiang Kai-shek's forces, despite Chiang's U.S. aid and the fickleness of the Soviet Union, who, in the end, engaged in negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek. So this was incredibly important that Mao won this war on his own. At least that is what he's going to say to many people, that, the Soviet Union did provide arms, but honestly, they just wanted a stable China. They didn't really care necessarily. And this was Stalin. By this time, Stalin had given up world revolution, by the way. So while it would have been great, it wasn't his priority. And honestly, this creates a problem for the rest of the 20th century on who was going to dominate the, Communist Party. Would it be Mao? Would it be Russia? This is going to play itself out in the Vietnam War as well. There are lots of reasons why Mao in the end won this battle. I mean, he was a better military commander. He trained his troops better. By 1948, he was getting better weapons from the Soviets, by the way. The peasantry were on his side, and he was better at the propaganda campaign. Mao Zedong gives a triumphant speech on October 1st, 1949, right in front of the former imperial palace, now named the Gate of Heavenly Peace. And, this is going to happen in Beijing, and crowds are going to cheer him, and the Red Army are going to go by. He's going to be surrounded by his loyal followers. Meanwhile, communist forces were still sweeping west and south and taking over everything. Chiang Kai-shek, with the remaining members of his army and government, fled to Taiwan and declared it to be the seat of the legitimate Chinese government. Many Western nations are only going to recognize Taiwan are the ROC, known as the Republic of China. This will last until about 1990. When declaring China and its new People's Republic, this is what Mao said in a radio speech. We announce the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Our nation will from now on enter the large family of peace-loving and freedom-loving nations of the world. It will work bravely and industriously to create its own civilization and happiness, and will, at the same time, promote world peace and freedom. Our nation will never again be an insulted nation. We have stood up.